So last but not least, I will give the floor to Jean-Yves. Pranchère.
Thank you, Chair. So first, I want to thank Marie-Laure for her invitation to this wonderful and very important conference. And second, I would apologize for my Franglish, for not being a friend of Carl Schmitt, as Julien said, for not using a PowerPoint, for not being a legal scholar, and for introducing the slightly offbeat perspective of political philosophy. So, as a political theorist, I have a specific interest in illiberal discourses, which I think play a certain role in the erosion of democracy. But it is impossible to give a panoramic view of these discourses because the corpus is absolutely huge and is very diverse in its contents and also in its forms. And here, I think we must distinguish between three distinct discursive registers. First, the really theoretical discourses that legitimize illiberal consequences. Second, the media-effective languages that disseminate illiberal themes or visions by presenting them as self-evident truths, which means by hammering those themes, and thirdly, rhetorical device and sub-argumentative, infra-argumentative mechanism that mock the norms of the rule of law and shape and energize illiberal sentiments. And here I think that, for example, internet memes play a huge role, actually, in the progress of illiberalism. So, having said this, my problem is that I have to describe a continuum of illiberal discourse which are very heterogeneous. But I think it's not a problem because continuity doesn't mean homogeneity, and you can have continuity with a strong heterogeneity. The world visions of the different illiberal discourses are very different, but the hatred are identical. And the continuity here is a convergence of the hatred with an heterogeneity of philosophical position. So we can use the word illiberalism to describe this continuum. And here I will come with two questions. The first question is, why is illiberalism a useful concept? While, for example, but this is my advice, but this is my opinion, illiberal democracy is not a good concept, and the use of populism, which we know all have, should be avoided. And it will be my first question. I will try to answer that. And this question covers another question, which is, should we not be aware of the risk of using concepts like illiberal democracies or populism, because our use of those concepts in a certain way contributes to the conceptual deconsolidation of democracy and of liberal democracy. When we say populism, for example, to describe illiberalism, we forget that many populist movements were liberal movements, were anti-fascist movements. The Front Populaire in France was totally populist, according to our criteria. The People's Party in the United States was a liberal democratic party. We can say exactly the same for the Russian populism. And we tend to forget that the opposite of populism is oligarchy. So if we attack populism, does it mean that we support oligarchy? And that's a huge problem, because saying populism, we convey the idea that oligarchic parties are, let's say, basic, salvage democratic parties. That's a huge problem. So I will try to say some words about that. And I would like to support three hypotheses, briefly. So first, that the heart of illiberalism must be found in the attack of human rights, and that's the decisive point. Second, when we consider the success of illiberalism, we can ask how can illiberalism be so appealing to so many people? What is so seducing in illiberalism? So I think the answer has to be sociological. But there is a political, theoretical aspect in this. What is seducing for people who are still attached to democracy in illiberalism? And I will try to say some word about this, and I will suggest that the political imaginary fueling the success of illiberalism is an imaginary of sovereignty, which manifests itself in very opposite and heterogeneous forms. And third, in conclusion, I will just suggest that in order to respond to illiberalism, you have to think in a renewed way the social foundation and maybe even the socialist foundation of the liberal societies. So, first point. Marine Laruelle, I pointed out that illiberalism is the name given to a, I quote, continuum of gradual deviation from liberal norms, end of quotation. So I will rely on that definition, because I think the very important point here is that illiberalism is a continuum. And the spectrum of this continuum ranges from the radical depoliticization or neutralization of human rights, which is, let's say, the mild form of illiberalism, to their radical rejection, which is the hard form of illiberalism, which can be simply fascist. And here I think that it should be emphasized that the term illiberalism should not be understood as denoting any dissociation between, as Marie-Laure said yesterday, between liberalism and democracy, but rather as an attack on their shared core principle, the assertion that individuals must be guaranteed their fundamental rights and that their political freedom requires this guarantee. Without fundamental rights and political freedoms are nothing but a lie. So illiberalism attacks simultaneously and inseparably liberalism and democracy, which is why it cannot be described either as an authoritarian liberalism, as some leftist thinker suggest, a liberalism which would guarantee individual economic rights in the absence of democratic institutions, nor as the proposal for an illiberal democracy which would assert the primacy of collective freedom over individual interest and cessation protected by the law. Sorry, I have to check my chronometer. Okay. So Justine Lacroix and I have proposed detailed argument challenging the validity of these two terms. I shall simply say that authoritarian liberalism is better described by market authoritarianism, as Warlouzet proposed, and illiberal democracy by electoral authoritarianism or electoral autocracy. So my point is, it's not absurd to make a distinction between liberalism and democracy, because liberalism and democracy had different history. It's clear. Democracy was not always liberal, and the 19th century liberalism in Europe resisted universal suffrage and political democracy. But the point is that during that history, liberalism and democracy have finally aligned themselves to the principle of equal rights for individuals, at last equal rights to have rights, as Arendt said. And the fact that, for example, Athenian democracy was a slave-owning society does not entitle us to claim that the project to restore slavery could be democratic. And the fact that the French Revolution was indifferent to women's rights does not mean that one can claim to defend human rights while seeking to deprive women of their rights. So, only those who refuse to regress beyond the principle of equal freedoms, who Tocqueville had already identified as the point of unity between liberalism and democracy, can be described as liberal and democrats. And once this point has been reached, Any attempt to turn back is a departure from liberalism and from democracy. Elections do not define democracy, and the existence of a capitalist market is not sufficient to define liberalism. So illiberalism should be defined as a regression away from the principle of the equality of freedoms, that is, the principle of human rights. And illiberalism seeks to reverse the process of democratization that has characterized liberalism and democracy since the 18th century. So in that sense, illiberalism is opposed to all forms of liberalism. So we cannot say that, for example, social democracy, republicanism, conservatism, and so on, so far they are not liberal in the narrow sense of the word, are illiberal. They are not. Illiberalism means a refusal of the common principle of conservatism, liberalism, socialism in the meaning of social democracy. And here it is worth noting that one of the earliest users of the adjective illiberal appeared in Leo Strauss' recension of the critical review of Carl Schmitt's The Concept of Political in 1932. And Strauss was illiberal, as Carl Schmitt. But the point is appreciated in Carl Schmitt's endeavor towards a illiberal political thought, breaking with the sidelining of the question of the good life in favor of the mere security of individuals, but it attacked the politic of hostility. And he opposed Schmitt that the Schmittian negation of liberalism, without any content of its own, remained caught in the snare of liberalism. So, he countered Schmitt by arguing that the heart of political lay in the question of justice and not of war. But he understood the question of justice in an anti-modern sense as a question of just natural hierarchies. So he agreed also with Schmitt on two essential points. First, the impossibility of a cosmopolitan society. So, in other words, the necessity that any political community form a closed society, not an open society, and the nonsense of human rights, in which Strauss saw nothing but a winning and ridiculous appeal. And still, it's impossible to be Straussian and Schmittian at the same time, as Adrian Vermeulen, for example, pretend to be. So, my second point will be on the question of sovereignty and human rights. So, from the outset, meaning from the end of the 18th century, modern democracy has been rejected by theocratic forces, which consider that only God has rights. And these forces are still very powerful in various parts of the world, but not so much in secular Europe. So I will consider more modern forces. Yesterday, Thomas insisted on the way the far right use the theme of freedom of expression against the freedom of expression, and I think we have to consider the way the far right use the idea of democracy against human rights. And this is only possible with a certain use of the idea of popular sovereignty. So I think this idea of sovereignty plays a very important role in the illiberal discourse. And here maybe we could remind the three-part division Karl Mannheim made between modern ideologies. I insist modern ideology. He said there is conservatism, who reacts to the human rights and to the revolution by moderating human rights as pure limits of the political, but not as political principles. There is liberalism that reduces human rights to individual rights, and there is socialism, which interprets human rights as social rights and as social law, droit social, as we say in French, and there is no real word in English for that, and that's a very interesting fact. Okay, but I would add that we should pay attention to the fact that this tripartite division, compared to the principle of human rights, splits into two. because each of the three currents admit two versions, a democratic one and a reactionary, even totalitarian one. So, for example, there is reactionary conservatism, conservative revolution, of which fascism is a form, who seeks to totally neutralize the human rights under the principle of the identity of the community or of the social order. There is a version of liberalism, which is doubled or overturned by social Darwinism and the project of eliminating the weak through the market as a principle of selection for the ruling class. And there is a Leninist version of socialism, which most argued was a reactionary movement with no other origin than a regime of terror-crushing society. And today we are witnessing, I think, the resurgence of illiberal version of the three modern ideologies. We have a reactionary nationalism centered on the defense of national identity, principally against Islam, and with, for example, in the US, with imperialist consequences, the sovereignty is interpreted as a kind of autarky. We have a libertarianism with both feudal and transhumanist overtones, which seeks to replace democratic compromise with the absolute property rights of corporate states wielding technological monopolies. And we have a Leninist revival in certain trends of the decolonial South that reduce the social relation of liberal society to coloniality of Western culture as a whole. And I will support the idea that, those three versions of illiberalism rely on a certain idea of sovereignty, national popular sovereignty, consumer sovereignty, like in neoliberalism, producer sovereignty, corporate sovereignty, or sovereignty of the cultural authenticity and of the cultural identity. So justifying this hypothesis in details would take a considerable amount of time. So my point is not to reject Habermas' thesis of the co-originality of human rights and popular sovereignty, because it is true that the sovereignty of the community of citizens requires that the citizens who comprise it be guaranteed their rights and freedoms, both private and public. But this co-originality does not resolve the question of how the sovereignty of individuals and the sovereignty of a collective that cannot be reduced to the individual who comprise it can be articulated. Actually, when we say sovereignty of the people, we mean four different things. Sovereignty of the individual and sovereignty of the individual against the state if the rule of law is at droit, sovereignty of the people, sovereignty of the nation, and sovereignty of the state. And the only legally clear point is that the state is sovereign. But the three other sovereignty are a political imagination or an imaginary, a very powerful and efficient and politically important imaginary, but an imaginary. So I don't have time to enter in a discussion of that imaginary and a description of that imaginary, but I think this is one of the democratic origin of our problem with illiberalism. We are not clear about sovereignty. So I would suggest that we add a deflationist, can you say that? A deflationist use of the concept of sovereignty, that we deflate the concept of sovereignty and that we insist more on the democratic autonomy understood as the capacity to deliberate rationally and to decide on the basis of a knowledge of the factual, social, and natural constraints. So, Claude Lefort used to say that the paradox of democratic sovereignty is that the principle of popular sovereignty means that nobody can be sovereign because nobody can pretend to be the people. So that's why the tradition of sovereignty of the people is not a sovereign people, but the fact that the place of sovereignty must symbolically, not really, but symbolically remain an empty space. And that could be the real tradition of populism. A populist is somebody who considers that nobody is over the people, and that nobody is the people. And that's why I think we should avoid that word of populism. So Lefort believed also that it was impossible to draw a dividing line between liberal rights and social rights. They are different, of course, but since social rights are the development of liberal rights, to attack social rights mean, in fact, to attack the liberal core of human rights, to dismantle what Rawls used to call the social basis of self-respect. And when you attack the social basis of self-respect, you produce people who can be easily seduced by illiberalism and authoritarianism. So I think it is impossible to confuse the predatory capitalism symbolized by Trump and the neoliberal project of constitutionalizing, the market order. But it is not less reasonable to believe that neoliberalism, understood as a project of a market society in which individuals become pure entrepreneurs of themselves, having the ability to exchange a right against advantages. That's the neoliberal intent to destroy the fabric of democratic sociality. And so I think it's doubtful that liberal rights can maintain their authority without the foundation of social law and the support of democratic society, so that the socialist policy could be understood as one that aims to ensure the social condition of liberal society. Thank you.
Thank you very much.